Welcome, dear listeners. Tonight, let your thoughts drift gently as we take you on a peaceful journey. This is a space for calm, for quiet moments, and for the kind of stories that settle your heart and slow your breath. Make yourself comfortable, close your eyes if you wish, and allow the world to soften around you. Now, let's begin with tonight's story. Today's story is titled, The Watchmaker's Promise: A Journey Through Time. Act 1, The Stillness Before the Start. The soft chirping of morning birds echoed faintly outside the window as the sun hesitantly crept above the sleepy rooftops of Elderberry Lane. The houses were still cloaked in that hushed tranquility that only came in the earliest hours before the coffee machines clicked on, before the doors creaked open, before the rush of the world returned. Inside a modest second-story apartment, a young man named Callum Breyer slowly stirred from sleep. He blinked, adjusting to the faint golden hue of morning that pooled on the wooden floorboards. The old clock on the nightstand showed 6:03 a.m. Much earlier than usual, even for a weekend. But today was different. Callum had always loved days with a purpose. Not the heavy, laborious kind. The gentle ones. The quiet ones. Like today, the day of the monthly Maple Street flea market. A smile tugged at the corner of his lips as he sat up, stretching his arms toward the ceiling. Outside, the sky was painted with soft oranges and sleepy blues. The kind of sky that felt like an invitation to pause and breathe. He shuffled into the small kitchen and put on a kettle for tea. As the water began to hum, Callum's eyes drifted toward the corkboard above his desk, where a small note was pinned with a crooked red tack. Flea market at 7. You're not getting out of it this time, Jules. He chuckled to himself. Jules Thorne, his best friend since high school, had made it her mission to pull Callum out of his comfortable bubble at least once a month. She claimed that adventures didn't always require mountain hikes or plane tickets. Sometimes, they waited in the dusty corners of old tables, beneath layers of forgotten things. Callum poured the tea into his favorite blue mug slightly chipped at the rim and took a moment to sip in silence. His apartment, though small, held the warmth of lived-in familiarity. Stacks of old books leaned against the walls, a weathered guitar sat quietly by the window, and a sleepy cat named Pepper curled lazily on the couch. He took his time choosing what to wear: something simple. A light gray hoodie, worn jeans, and sneakers that had clearly seen better days. As he tied his laces, his mind wandered to the last time they'd gone to the flea market. Jules had found a hand-painted globe lamp, and Callum had somehow ended up buying a set of vinyl records for a record player he didn't even own. It wasn't really about the things they found, it was the feeling. The people. The slow magic of time unfolding. A soft buzz from his phone broke his thoughts. It was a message from Jules. Outside. I brought cinnamon rolls. And sarcasm. Callum grinned, grabbed his keys, and pocketed his phone. One last sip of tea. One last glance around. Then he stepped out into the cool morning air. The moment the door clicked behind him, he was greeted by the faint scent of cinnamon and the sight of Jules leaning against her mint-colored hatchback, holding a coffee cup in one hand and a pastry bag in the other. Her red hair was tied up in a loose bun, and she wore her signature denim jacket adorned with enamel pins and tiny patches that told their own stories. "Morning, sunshine," she greeted with a smirk. "Did the bed try to kidnap you again?" Fiercely, Callum replied, accepting a cinnamon roll with a thankful nod. "But I managed to escape." They both laughed, a sound that bounced lightly down the quiet street. There was no rush. No urgency. Just the slow, unfolding rhythm of a day beginning. As they drove through town, the streets were just starting to come alive. Bicycles zipped past in a blur. Shop owners were propping open doors. And overhead, the sun began to stretch its rays over rooftops like fingers brushing pages in a book. The Maple Street flea market wasn't huge, but it was beloved. Held in an old lot behind the train station, it gathered people from all over the county, some to sell, some to browse, some just to sip coffee and listen to the jazz band that always showed up around mid-morning. Callum glanced out the window as the town blurred by. Something inside him settled. Not with excitement, but with a kind of quiet contentment. There was something timeless about mornings like this, about stepping into a story you didn't know you were part of yet. Jules broke the silence. "So, what's the goal today?" "Vintage cameras you'll never use. Mugs for your already overflowing shelf." Callum smirked. "Maybe I'll find something completely useless that I absolutely need." "You always do." The car turned onto a tree-lined road. Just ahead, the early birds of the market were already setting up colorful canopies, folding tables, handwritten signs. It was a mosaic of mismatched history, laughter, and rust. As Jules parked under a wide sycamore tree, Callum felt that familiar flutter. The feeling that maybe, just maybe, today held something unexpected. Something worth remembering. And as he stepped out of the car, breathing in the scent of earth and old books, he knew, this wasn't just a morning at the flea market. It was the beginning of something. Something simple. Something real. Act 2, the road to stories waiting to be found. The gentle crunch of gravel underfoot was the only sound as Callum and Jules made their way through the narrow path that led to the heart of the flea market. Morning sunlight filtered through the canopy of trees, casting shifting shadows over the stalls that were slowly springing to life. It was still early, but the place already held that electric murmur of stories about to unfold. Jules sipped her coffee and pointed toward a row of vendors unpacking crates. "That's Miriam, queen of antique buttons," she whispered. Legend has it she once bartered a Victorian tea set for a typewriter signed by Hemingway. Callum raised an eyebrow. "You're just making stuff up now." She grinned. "Maybe. But isn't that what makes it fun?" They passed by a man meticulously arranging stacks of vinyl records, each sleeve lovingly encased in plastic. The soft sound of old jazz played from a speaker hidden beneath the table. A few feet ahead, a couple in their 70s were setting out a checkered tablecloth, preparing to display an assortment of crystal vases and porcelain figurines. "See," Jules murmured. "Even the air smells like secrets." Callum laughed. "Smells more like mothballs and cinnamon rolls, but okay." The flea market was a patchwork of nostalgia. Each table, each crate, each rusted tin or cracked photo frame was a doorway to a different time, a different life. There were rows of faded postcards from countries Callum had only read about. Leather-bound books with handwritten dedications from people long gone. Even an old military coat with polished brass buttons and initials stitched into the lining, A. H. "Imagine the lives these things have lived," Callum said quietly, tracing a finger along the spine of a dusty novel. Jules looked at him, her expression softening. "That's why I love this place. It's not just a market, it's memory in motion." They walked past a stall with broken clocks and pocket watches. Callum paused, mesmerized. A brass pocket watch lay open on a velvet cloth. Its gears exposed, ticking faintly, like a quiet heartbeat still clinging to time. The vendor, a wiry man with thick spectacles, noticed. "Still works," he said proudly. "Belonged to a train conductor back in the 30s. Traveled across the country twice a month." Callum's gaze lingered. Something about the watch tugged at him. It was simple, worn, but dignified. He didn't buy it. Not yet. But he made a mental note of the stall's location. Meanwhile, Jules had wandered toward a nearby booth overflowing with vintage board games. She picked up a box labeled Galaxy Quest, The Adventure Begins, and laughed. "I had this as a kid. My brother and I used to argue for hours over who got to be the star captain." A familiar voice cut through the morning chatter. "Still cheating at board games, Thorne?" They turned to see Ezra Fielding, a lanky artist friend of Jules, balancing a rolled-up canvas under one arm and a thermos in the other. His flannel shirt was paint-streaked, and his smile carried that effortless charm only people who lived in daydreams seemed to possess. "Ezra." Jules waved. "I thought you only sold your stuff at the spring fair." "Decided to set up a stall last minute," he said, holding up a small framed painting. "Dreamed of a lake last night. Woke up and painted it. Figured someone else might dream of it too." Callum glanced at the painting. It was soft and abstract, but something about the brush strokes felt like breathing. Ezra tilted his head. "You're Callum, right? The guy with the existential playlists." Callum blinked. "That sounds accurate." They laughed and chatted for a bit longer before Ezra wandered off, promising to save them a spot near the bandstand when the live music started later. As they continued exploring, The crowd slowly grew. Families with strollers. Teenagers digging through boxes of old CDs. Elderly couples strolling hand in hand. The market was no longer quiet, it was alive. A symphony of footsteps, greetings, laughter, the clinking of mugs, and the occasional bark of a dog tied to a post. Jules tugged at Callum's sleeve. "Okay, we need a mission. A true quest." Callum looked thoughtful. "How about, find the weirdest, most wonderfully useless item we can't live without?" Jules smirked. "You're on." With that, they split up, agreeing to meet near the food trucks in an hour. Callum turned down a narrow aisle lined with boxes, crates, and stacked wooden drawers. There was something about wandering alone here that felt almost sacred. Like the past was whispering to him in layers of dust and faded price tags. He picked up a weathered photograph in a silver frame. A man in a navy uniform stood next to a woman in a polka-dotted dress, both smiling like they knew something the world didn't. Callum wondered who they were, where they were now, if someone missed them. Nearby, a little girl tugged at her grandmother's coat. "Nana, look. It's a unicorn cup." The woman laughed, then leaned down and whispered something, and they both giggled. Callum smiled. The market wasn't just a place for things. It was a place for moments. A place where people remembered how to wonder again. He glanced down at the photograph in his hand one last time before gently placing it back on the table. Today had barely begun, and already, it was becoming a story worth telling. Act 3, Isles of Wonder and Forgotten Things. The morning wore on, and the sun began to rise higher, casting golden beams over the canvas canopies that stretched across Maple Street's flea market. Callum wandered slowly, alone now, each footstep deliberate, like he was walking through a museum that had forgotten it was one. Every few steps, he stopped. At one table, a wooden crate was filled with stacks of letters bound by fraying twine. Handwritten addresses in looping cursive. Faded postmarks from decades ago. He picked up a bundle and gently untied it. Inside, he read a fragment. "The garden is blooming again this spring. It's strange how things keep growing even when we don't. I miss your laughter. The birds do too, I think." He closed the letter slowly, feeling the weight of a life in those few lines. Someone had loved. Someone had written. And now, the words lay here, for strangers to find. At the next stall, he stumbled upon a collection of old cameras. Film cameras. Mechanical wonders. He picked up one solid, all metal, etched with tiny scratches from years of use. It reminded him of his father, who used to take pictures with a camera just like this. Sunday afternoons in the park, telling Callum to stand still, just one more second. He smiled, setting it down carefully. Just ahead, an elderly woman sat behind a table draped in lace. Her booth was filled with hand-stitched quilts, each one folded with care. Callum ran his fingers along the fabric, noticing initials embroidered in the corners: M, E, or sometimes just a heart. The woman noticed. "That one was for my granddaughter," she said, her voice warm and low. "She likes stars. Said they made her feel safe." Callum looked at the quilt again. Tiny constellations danced across the navy blue fabric. "It's beautiful. She's grown now. But I still make one every winter," the woman said with a soft smile. He thanked her and moved on. Meanwhile, Jules was on a mission of her own. She had wandered into a row of booths that specialized in what could only be described as delightfully unnecessary things. A table full of porcelain animal figurines. Another stacked high with VHS tapes of obscure documentaries and home videos labeled Linda's 4th birthday or Camping 92. And then she saw it. A ceramic frog lamp. About a foot tall. Wearing a tiny top hat. The frog's belly lit up like a lantern, its eyes wide in a permanent state of joyful confusion. "This," Jules whispered reverently, "is destiny." She picked it up and carried it like it was the Holy Grail. The vendor, a young man wearing a knitted beanie and reading The Wind in the Willows, looked up and gave her a knowing nod. "You have excellent taste," he said. Jules winked. "I know." Back on the other side of the market, Callum had found a stack of old vinyl records. He flipped through them, amused by the covers: psychedelic swirls, jazz quartets, melancholic faces frozen in time. One album caught his eye. Echoes Between the Pines. He'd never heard of it, but something about the title struck a chord. A soft voice beside him spoke, "That one's good for rainy evenings. Or heartbreak." He turned and saw a woman about his age, tall, curly hair, wearing oversized headphones around her neck. "Music recommendations from strangers," Callum said. "I like it." She smiled. "I'm Lena. I run a little vinyl shop downtown." They talked for a few minutes about records, how vinyl felt more honest than digital, about the way old songs held memories you didn't know you had. Then, with a small wave, she disappeared into the crowd, leaving Callum holding the record and a curious warmth in his chest. He looked down at it again. Maybe heartbreak wasn't a requirement. He turned the corner, and there was Jules, beaming and holding the ceramic frog lamp high above her head like a trophy. "Found the weirdest, most wonderful thing," she announced. "Beat that." Callum raised the record. Melancholy folk album from 1977. "Touché," she said. "We're both brilliant." They wandered to the edge of the market, where a small jazz band had started playing beneath the shade of an oak tree. A few people had gathered, some sitting on benches, others swaying gently to the rhythm. The scent of fresh pretzels and roasted nuts wafted from nearby food carts. Callum and Jules found a spot on the grass and sat down. The frog lamp sat proudly between them. "I forgot how much I needed this," Callum said. "This?" Jules motioned around them. "Or the frog?" He smiled. "All of it?" They didn't say much after that. They just listened. To the music, to the market's soft rustling, to the slow hum of a world that wasn't asking anything of them right now except maybe to sit a little longer, breathe a little deeper, and remember that wonder could still be found in the quietest places. Act 4, the object that waited to be found. The sun had risen to a soft crescendo by mid-morning, bathing the flea market in a mellow warmth that made everything shimmer like a dream still half remembered. The jazz band played a languid tune in the distance, the trumpet sighing like it too had a story to tell but didn't want to rush. Callum wandered again, this time with a slower pace, his footsteps less about searching and more about listening. Not with ears, but with something deeper. There was a rhythm here between the stalls, between the laughter and quiet conversations, between time itself. He turned down a small gravel path slightly hidden by a line of colorful rugs draped over makeshift clotheslines. The rugs waved gently in the breeze, forming a sort of fabric curtain to a quieter section of the market. Few people ventured there. It was where the older vendors set up, the ones who didn't care about layout or aesthetics. Their tables were mismatched, sometimes just blankets on the ground, their items scattered with charming chaos. And that's where he saw it. A small wooden case, worn but elegant, half hidden beneath a faded trench coat and a stack of dusty sheet music. Something about the case drew him in. It wasn't flashy. In fact, it was so unassuming that most people probably didn't give it a second glance. But to Callum, it glowed. He knelt down and brushed the dust off the top. No label. No markings. The vendor, an older woman with long silver braids and eyes that had clearly seen 100 lifetimes, noticed his curiosity and shuffled over. Her name tag read simply, Agnes. "That belonged to my brother," she said, her voice like dry leaves rustling in wind. "He was a violinist. Played all through Europe before the war." Callum's hands hovered over the latch. "May I?" She nodded. The latch clicked open with a soft snap, and inside was an old violin still cradled in its velvet lining like it was sleeping. The wood had darkened with age, and the bow beside it was wrapped in brittle rosin-stained ribbon. A faint fragrance of pine and varnish still clung to the case, as if it remembered every concert hall, every train station, every moment it had sung. Callum reached out, almost reverently, and touched the edge of the instrument. Agnes sat down slowly on a nearby crate. He used to say the violin had a soul of its own. That it only spoke clearly when someone listened without trying to control it. "Did he stop playing?" Callum asked quietly. She smiled, sad and proud all at once. "No." He played till his last breath. Said if the world ended, he'd go out playing the final note. Callum didn't know why, but his throat tightened. He wasn't a musician. He didn't even know how to hold a violin properly. And yet, something about the instrument, the story behind it, the care it was kept in, the way it had waited quietly through the years called to him like an echo he didn't know he'd been chasing. How much? He asked. Agnes looked at him, long and thoughtful. For you. $30. And a promise. Callum blinked. A promise. That you don't let it stay quiet? He hesitated, then nodded. I promise. The transaction was quick, quiet, like a secret between them. She placed the violin back in its case and handed it to him with both hands. I think it waited for you, she said. Callum carried the case like something sacred. As he turned back toward the main market path, the music from the bandstand shifted a slow, melodic swing that seemed to mirror the rhythm of his own heartbeat. When he returned to the food truck area, Jules was sitting cross-legged on the grass, munching on a soft pretzel with mustard smeared like war paint across her cheek. She looked up and froze. What is that? Callum sat beside her and gently set the case down. A violin. Or a soul in a wooden shell, depending on who you ask. Jules tilted her head. You don't play the violin. I don't, he said. A beat of silence. Then she grinned. But you will now, huh? He laughed. Maybe I'll just hold it and pretend to be mysterious. You're already halfway there. They shared the pretzel and watched as the band welcomed a guest saxophonist, Ezra, apparently who launched into a dreamy, melancholic solo that caused several birds nearby to pause mid-song. A group of children danced in front of the stage, spinning with wild abandon. An older man in suspenders tapped his foot while sipping lemonade. Somewhere in the crowd, Lena from the record stall waved briefly at Callum before vanishing again. Jules leaned back on her elbows. You know, she said, every time we come here, something weirdly poetic happens. Like the frog lamp. He teased. Exactly. Callum looked down at the violin case and then up at the sky. I think today I found something I didn't know I'd lost, he said. Jules smiled. That's the flea market magic. You don't just find stuff. Stuff finds you. He nodded, holding the case close, not because of its monetary value but because of the weight it now carried. A weight of music. Of history. Of a story passed into his hands, quiet and eternal. They sat together in silence after that, not empty silence, but the kind that was full of understanding. And somewhere, in the symphony of soft chatter, laughter, music, and wind-blown dust, a promise hung in the air, that the violin would not remain silent. That stories, even those buried beneath decades, still had the power to find their way back to light. Act 5, Stories Between the Stalls. The breeze was soft and warm now, slipping through the maze of stalls like a curious cat. The Maple Street Flea Market had shifted into its midday rhythm, a slower, more contemplative pace. The early crowd had thinned. The families with toddlers had made their way out, and the real wanderers remained, the storytellers, the collectors, the quiet souls in search of something more than just bargains. Callum stood with the violin case slung over his shoulder like a satchel of secrets. Jules walked beside him, now the proud guardian of the ceramic frog lamp wrapped in layers of old newspaper. They moved without agenda, letting the market guide them rather than the other way around. They turned a corner and were immediately greeted by the smell of something rich and familiar, cinnamon, butter, and a hint of brown sugar. A petite woman behind a food stall smiled at them, flipping what looked like stuffed pastries on a small griddle. "Hand pies," she announced cheerily. "Made with my grandma's recipe." She swore the secret was humming while you folded the dough. Jules was sold instantly. "We'll take two." As they munched, Callum noticed a small wooden bench set up near the edge of the vendor's stall. Seated there were an elderly couple, both neatly dressed, their matching sun hats tilted just slightly in the same direction. "Mind if we join you?" Callum asked politely. The old man looked up and beamed. Of course, of course. A bench without company is just a piece of wood." They sat. The woman offered a gentle nod. "I'm Maureen." "This is Harold." "Callum," he replied, then motioned to Jules. "And this is Jules." Harold chuckled. "Ah, a strong name. My first car was named Jules." "Was she reliable?" Jules asked, eyebrow raised. "Only when I spoke to her nicely." Everyone laughed. The kind of laugh that melts barriers and builds bridges. After a pause, Maureen reached into her canvas bag and pulled out an old black and white photograph. It was small, dog-eared, but clearly cherished. In the picture, a young man in uniform smiled shyly beside a woman in a polka-dotted dress. "That's us," she said softly. Taken right before Harold was deployed. "You served?" Callum asked. Harold nodded. "Navy. Spent most of my time on a floating hunk of steel wondering how a boy from Iowa ended up staring at the Indian Ocean." Maureen squeezed his hand. "Every week, I'd write him a letter and include something from the flea market. A pressed flower, a recipe, once even a button from my coat." Jules leaned in. "You mailed a button?" Maureen's eyes twinkled. "I told him if he ever lost heart, he could press it and remember where home was." Callum smiled. "Did it work?" Harold patted his chest pocket. Still got it? The conversation shifted gently from wartime memories to gardening tips, from grandchildren to the best cinnamon bun in the county, which apparently, according to Maureen, was not the one they were currently eating. It felt less like talking to strangers and more like being folded into a story already in progress. A boy ran past, chasing a rogue balloon. Somewhere nearby, a violinist played a slow tune not expertly, but with so much soul that Callum paused, wondering if that could be him one day. Then Jules spotted something that made her freeze. At a nearby stall, a large wooden crate was overflowing with fabric scraps. But sticking out from the top was something unmistakable, a piece of cloth embroidered with the name Thorn in looping letters. "No way," she whispered, and rushed over. Callum followed. The vendor, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and a button-up shirt too big for him, looked up from his crossword puzzle. "That piece caught your eye?" Jules pulled it out completely. It was a small quilt panel, rough around the edges, clearly handmade. Below the embroidered name were 3 dates and a faded paw print. "This was my dog," she said, almost in disbelief. "Sparrow." The vendor scratched his chin. "I got that in a donation box last winter." Old woman dropped off a bunch of fabric. Said it was from her niece's old craft bin. Callum looked at her. "You don't think?" "I used to come to the flea market with my aunt when I was little," Jules murmured. "She helped me stitch this. It got lost in a move years ago. I thought it was gone forever." She clutched the panel to her chest, her usual playful bravado replaced with something quieter. "It's like, it waited for me." The vendor handed it over. "On the house." "No way," Jules said, reaching for her wallet. The man shook his head. "It belongs to you. Always did." As they walked away, she turned to Callum. "Okay, fine. Maybe your violin isn't the only magical thing we've found today." Callum grinned. "Welcome to the club." They passed Ezra again, now seated on a crate and sketching quick portraits of people walking by. His canvas was filled with fleeting expressions, a smile here, a furrowed brow there. He waved as they passed, and without a word, flipped his sketchpad around to reveal a surprise. Callum and Jules. Captured mid-laugh, standing side by side, the ceramic frog lamp tucked under her arm, the violin case slung across his shoulder like a traveler. "You two look like characters out of a novel," Ezra said. "Let's hope it's not a tragic one," Callum replied. Ezra winked. "Not with that frog. He's clearly the hero." They moved on again, weaving through stalls now glowing in the honeyed afternoon light. Conversations hummed in the background. A girl sang softly as she sold homemade candles. A man recited poetry for tips. Someone offered free hugs beside a basket of fresh oranges. Everywhere they looked, there were little universes tucked inside cracked teacups, old paintings, and jars of buttons. And between it all, people. Laughing. Remembering. Beginning again. Do you think, Callum said as they paused near the exit, that we'll ever find a market like this again? Jules shrugged. Maybe not. But I think, the right things will always find us, one way or another. Callum nodded slowly, then glanced at the sky. The sun had begun its descent. But their story? It was only getting started. Act 6, Warm Bites and Wandering Thoughts. The afternoon sun poured over Maple Street like syrup over warm pancakes, coating everything in a soft amber glow. The once crowded flea market had thinned out, leaving behind a quieter, more reflective version of itself. The kind of crowd that spoke in softer voices, browsed in lingering strolls, and carried their purchases like found memories rather than impulse buys. Callum and Jules found themselves back near the food stalls, bellies rumbling, and hearts full. The air smelled deliciously chaotic smoky sausages, sweet kettle corn, garlic noodles, citrus teas, and something spicy that made Callum's eyes water just by standing near it. I vote we eat something that doesn't try to kill us on contact, Callum muttered, steering away from the fiery taco stand, breathing dragon's breath into the air. Jules pointed to a bright yellow food truck with a handwritten chalkboard sign that read, Cozy Bites, Soul Food and Small Talks. That sounds promising, she said. As they approached, a woman with laugh lines, henna-dyed hair, and a vibrant scarf tied around her apron greeted them from behind the counter. Welcome to Cozy Bites. You look like grilled cheese people. Jules blinked. That obvious? The woman smiled. It's the vibe. They ordered 2 grilled cheese sandwiches with caramelized onions and a side of tomato soup, plus 2 iced herbal teas, lemon verbena and lavender blend. While waiting, Callum glanced at the truck's side panel, where dozens of Polaroids were pinned under a banner that said "People We've Fed" and their one-word wishes. Each photo had a person young, old, cheerful, somber, holding a tiny sign with one word written in Sharpie. Peace. Laughter. Forgiveness. Sleep. Time. Think they'll ask us for a word? Callum asked. Hope so, Jules replied. I'm ready with, like, 5. When their food was ready, the woman handed it to them along with a Polaroid camera. You know the drill, she said. Callum grinned. We're new. Enlighten us. She pointed to the banner. You eat, then you pick one word. Something you want more of in your life. I snap a photo. You join the wall. I love that, Jules whispered. They took their tray to a nearby bench under a small tree, where wind chimes tinkled lazily above their heads. The bench had 2 cushions, one mismatched, one slightly sun-faded and a small vase of fresh daisies set between them on a crate turntable. They didn't talk much at first. The food was too good. The cheese was perfectly gooey, the onions sweet and soft, and the soup warm and nostalgic. Jules let out a dramatic sigh after her first bite. "I could write poetry about this sandwich," she said. "Probably already exists," Callum replied between spoonfuls. "Ode to a cheddar melt." They laughed and sipped their teas. For a while, everything slowed. No phones. No obligations. Just food, a warm breeze, and the occasional squeal of a child chasing bubbles nearby. Jules leaned back, letting her head tilt toward the tree's leaves. "This is the part of life no one teaches you to value. You're taught to chase milestones. Big things. But this right here, grilled cheese and daisies and quiet company, this is the stuff." Callum nodded. "I'd bottle this moment if I could." After they finished, they returned to the food truck. "All right, what's your word?" the woman asked, holding up the Polaroid camera. Callum thought for a moment. "Presence." Jules didn't hesitate. "Return." The woman raised an eyebrow. "That's a rare one." Jules smiled softly. "It's about finding something you thought you lost." The shutter clicked. Twice. A minute later, 2 photos dried on the truck's side. Callum holding his violin case with the word presence below. Jules cradling her frog lamp with the word return shining like a beacon. As they stood back and looked at the wall, a voice spoke from behind them. "Good words. You two look like characters from a movie." They turned to see a man in his 20s, wearing round glasses and a camera slung over his shoulder. His t-shirt had a design of a moon smiling at a cup of tea. "Name's Theo," he said, offering a fist bump. "I've been taking street portraits here since last year. Want one?" Jules raised an eyebrow. "Will you make us look mysterious and soulful?" "I'll do my best," he smirked. They posed. The frog lamp made another appearance. Theo clicked away with the ease of someone who saw more than most people did. As he showed them the photos on the camera's screen, Callum felt something stir in him, a sense of being documented, not for a profile picture, not for social media, but just for existing. "You ever feel," he asked Jules quietly, "like today is the kind of day we'll remember when we're old? Like it's being stitched into us somehow?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned to him and said, "I think days like today are proof that we're still paying attention." They said goodbye to Theo, who promised to email the portraits. As they walked away from Cozy Bites, Callum looked back one last time. The yellow truck. The wall of wishes. The daisies on the bench. All of it was still there, but somehow, he felt different now. Not because of the sandwich. Not even because of the violin or the photos. But because the world had opened just enough to let him in, not as a spectator, but as someone who belonged. And in that soft sliver of afternoon light, he whispered almost to himself, "I'm glad we came today." Jules heard him. "Me too," she said. "Let's never stop coming back." Act 7, The Vendor Who Remembered Everything. The sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the cobblestone paths of the market. A golden hush wrapped itself around Maple Street, as though the day had sighed contentedly and decided to slow down for a while. Callum and Jules, still buzzing from their cozy bites lunch, meandered deeper into the older parts of the flea market, the ones less visited, more mysterious. This area didn't have bright canopies or polished displays. The tables were older, patched together with tape or twine. The goods lay scattered across worn blankets or stacked haphazardly in milk crates and dusty bins. But there was a charm here. A kind of quiet resilience. Jules stopped short and pointed ahead. "There," she said, eyes alight. "That's exactly who I hoped we'd find." Sitting on a folding chair behind an overflowing table was a man who looked like he had never missed a single flea market since the beginning of time. His name, scrawled on a little woodburn sign beside a chipped teacup, read, Mr. Quince, Memory Merchant. He wore a flat cap tilted just so, suspenders holding up pants a few inches too short, and glasses that magnified his eyes to owl-like proportions. A red thermos sat beside him, steaming faintly, and he hummed some tune as he rearranged a tray of rusty keys. "Mr. Quince," Jules greeted with a little bow, "your legend precedes you." The man looked up slowly, taking in the frog lamp under her arm, the violin case on Callum's shoulder, and the sparkle of amusement in their eyes. "I see you've already been cursed," he said with mock seriousness, pointing at the frog. "Careful, he steals dreams and secrets." Jules gasped. "Then he fits right in." They approached the table, which was covered in what looked like random bric-a-brac, old spoons, marbles, doll shoes, broken lighters, yellowing playing cards, tiny bottles with handwritten labels. Like rainwater, 1984 and air from the Alps. Callum picked up a silver coin drilled with a hole. "This real?" "As real as the story that comes with it," Mr. Quince said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "Which is?" Callum asked. Quince grinned. "Once belonged to a boy who swallowed it for luck before a spelling bee. He won. Couldn't eat apples for 3 weeks after." They laughed, but Jules was already transfixed by a small leather-bound book with no title on the spine. She opened it carefully and saw that the pages were filled with nothing. All blank. "Is this a journal?" she asked. "Nope," said Mr. Quince. "It's a memory eraser." Write down what you want to forget. Close the book. When you open it again, it's gone. Jules raised an eyebrow. What if I write something happy? Then you better hope you're not the sentimental type. They continued browsing, asking questions, getting odd and enchanting answers. Everything on Mr. Quince's table seemed to carry a story too strange to be entirely made up, but too magical to be entirely real. Then Callum noticed a small box tucked away behind an old phonograph horn. It was wooden, unassuming, with a brass latch and delicate carvings along the sides, little spirals and constellations. "What's this?" he asked, picking it up. Mr. Quince didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow sip from his thermos. "That," he said eventually, "is the listening box." Jules leaned in. "What does it do?" Quince's eyes twinkled. "You write a question. Something you don't dare ask anyone else. Place it inside. Come back the next day. The answer will be there. Or maybe a riddle. Or a leaf. Depends on the question." Callum opened it slowly. Empty. But clean. Almost, waiting. He closed it again. "And people actually try this?" "Oh, hundreds," Quince replied. "Some even leave chocolate. For the box's trouble." "Did they get what they wanted?" Jules asked. Mr. Quince shrugged. "Everyone gets something. Not always what they expect." They stood in thoughtful silence for a moment. Then Jules suddenly laughed. "I'll take it." Quince gave a theatrical bow. "May the answers be at least mildly useful." As Jules handed over a few crumpled bills, Callum watched the exchange with quiet amusement. But then Mr. Quince turned to him, gaze a little sharper now. "You're the violin boy." Callum blinked. I guess I am." "Agnes sold it to you," Quince said, nodding slowly. "She doesn't part with things easily. You must have looked like someone who needed a second chance." Callum didn't know what to say to that. "She told me once," Quince continued, that violin only responds to honest hands. Doesn't care about skill. Just truth." Callum glanced at the case over his shoulder, suddenly aware of its weight again. "I haven't even played it yet." Quince grinned. "Then it hasn't heard your story yet." They stood there a moment longer. The wind shifted slightly. Leaves rustled. Somewhere a child called out for their mom. And Mr. Quince leaned back in his chair, humming the same tune from earlier, watching the world with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. As they walked away, Jules said, That man is a walking fairy tale. Callum smiled. I don't think he's walking much. But yet. She hugged the box to her chest. I already have a question in mind. Oh yet. Yup. Going to tell me? Nope. They made their way back toward the main market path, passing other stalls now winding down for the day. But something about Mr. Quince lingered. His words. His objects. The sense that behind every item was a thread that tied it to something greater. And Callum, still holding the coin with the drilled hole in his pocket now, realized something strange. He believed all of it. Act 8, the road back, and the quiet that lingers. The light had shifted. The afternoon glow had grown tired, mellowed into a buttery haze that made the flea market shimmer like a memory already fading into the folds of time. Vendors began to pack up. The sound of folding tables echoed gently through the air. The jazz band had long since gone quiet, replaced by the soft click of latches, the rustle of tarp being rolled up, and the last-minute chatter of die-hard browsers bargaining for one final treasure. Callum and Jules stood at the edge of the gravel path, near the sycamore tree where her mint-colored hatchback waited, now dappled in golden leaves like it had fallen asleep under an autumn sky. Both carried their strange and beautiful finds, the violin and the listening box for him, the ceramic frog lamp and memory quilt panel for her. But neither seemed in a hurry to go. Instead, they just stood there. Looking. Breathing. Like two people who knew a door had just closed behind them, even if they couldn't quite name which one. You ready? Jules finally asked. Callum didn't answer immediately. His eyes were scanning the market one last time, Mr. Quince still in his chair, tipping his cap lazily at no one in particular, Ezra sketching by lamplight near the now vacant bandstand, Theo. Photographing shadows on cobblestones. Then he turned back to her. Yeah. But also, not really. Same. They opened the car doors, carefully placed their treasures in the back seat like sacred relics, and slid into their usual positions, Jules at the wheel, Callum in the passenger seat with one knee folded under him, elbow resting on the window frame like a makeshift poet. Jules started the engine. The soft purr of the car felt like a shift in worlds. As they pulled away, the market slowly receded in the rearview mirror. First the food stalls, then the winding aisles, the flags fluttering over cozy bites, the glint of Polaroids pinned to yellow metal. Callum turned to look back through the rear window. It already looks like it's disappearing. That's the trick of places like this, Jules said, eyes still on the road. They vanish fast. Like dreams. They drove in silence for a while. The kind of silence that didn't feel empty, but full. The road ahead unfurled like a ribbon of soft gray beneath a peach-toned sky. Houses passed. Trees blurred. The town melted away. Callum eventually spoke. You ever feel like some days aren't just days? Jules glanced sideways. What do you mean? Like today, he said, fiddling with the brass coin Mr. Quince had given him. It wasn't just a Saturday. It felt like a turning point. Like a page in a book where everything quiet shifts. Jules thought for a moment. Yeah. But maybe not a turning point. Maybe a bookmark. He looked at her. A bookmark. She nodded. A place to come back to. A moment that says, this mattered. He smiled faintly. That's nice. They drove past the edge of town. A cornfield flashed by, gold and rustling in the breeze. Somewhere, a dog barked lazily in the distance. On a fence post, a crow tilted its head and watched them go. You know what I love most about days like this? Jules said suddenly. What? No one asked us to be anything. Callum turned to her, brow furrowed in curiosity. We weren't performing, she said. Not for bosses. Not for families. Not even for ourselves. We were just being. He nodded slowly. The thought sat with him. Heavy in the best way. As the car crested a small hill, they could see the town sprawled out below, bathed in the last breath of sunlight. Rooftops glinted like storybook illustrations. The distant sound of wind chimes reached them from somewhere unseen. Jules pulled over at a lookout point, one they hadn't planned to stop at. There was a wooden bench under an old oak, and from there, you could see everything: the market grounds now just a speck, the winding roads, the quiet fields. They got out. Sat. Said nothing. The sky was turning lavender. Callum rested the violin case across his lap. He hadn't opened it since the moment Agnes handed it to him, but now his fingers itched to lift the latch. He didn't, though. Not yet. Some things needed silence before they could sing. Jules placed the frog lamp beside her on the bench. In the dusk light, it looked almost majestic. They watched as the sun slipped behind the horizon. Shadows stretched. The air grew cooler. Then, without looking away, Jules said, "Promise me something." "Yeah." "That we don't wait another month before we do something like this again." Callum smiled. "We could do it next weekend." "I was thinking tomorrow." They both laughed, soft and surprised. Then silence again. Not uncomfortable. Just true. A car passed behind them. Birds settled in for the night. Somewhere a windmill creaked. And in that hush, between breaths and memories, Callum thought. This is what it means to return to yourself. Not in a grand, fireworks kind of way, but in the gentle kind. The grilled cheese and Polaroid kind. The strange violin and ceramic frog kind. The way the soul remembers, quiet, persistent, and beautiful. Eventually, they stood. Returned to the car. Drove home in the dark, windows cracked just enough to let the night inside. They didn't speak again until Jules pulled into Callum's driveway. He turned to her before getting out. Thanks for dragging me out of bed. Always, she said, tapping the frog lamp affectionately. He carried the violin in one hand, the coin in his pocket, the weight of the day on his shoulders like a worn but beloved coat. And as the door shut behind him, and he looked around his little apartment, everything was the same. But he wasn't. Act 9, What stays after the day ends? It was late. The kind of late where even the moon seemed drowsy, hanging lazily above rooftops like a lantern dim to a whisper. Elderberry Lane was quiet, the familiar hum of distant city life reduced to soft breaths between the trees. Inside his apartment, Callum stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by the quiet artifacts of his day. The violin case sat on the coffee table, unopened but humming with invisible weight. The brass coin from Mr. Quince spun slowly where he had flicked it earlier, wobbling, then settling. He turned on a soft lamp in the corner. Its golden light spread across the room, catching the glint of dust motes floating like snow in slow motion. Pepper, his sleepy gray cat, padded over, stretched like a noodle, and curled beside the violin as if guarding it. Callum chuckled softly. There was still so much to unpack, not just from the tote bag of finds and souvenirs, but from the day itself. Every hour had added a new layer to him, a memory, a scent, a quiet realization. He felt a bit like a book someone had scribbled in all over the margins. Not rewritten, just added to. He took a slow breath, crossed the room, and finally sat down. Not on the couch. On the floor. The kind of sitting where you're not doing anything in particular. Not scrolling. Not writing. Just existing. From the bag beside him, he gently pulled out one item at a time. The blank-paged book from Mr. Quince, still waiting to swallow a memory or two. A Polaroid of him holding the violin, the word presence written beneath his hesitant smile. The album echoes between the pines, its cover worn but still elegant. And lastly, the wooden box. The one Jules had called the listening box, even though it technically belonged to her now. She'd let him borrow it for the night. Said he looked like someone who needed to ask something. He set it beside him. There was a quiet tension in the air now, not heavy, just intimate. As if the walls of the room leaned in a little closer to hear what he'd say. He reached for a note card and pen. What am I supposed to do with what I've found? He folded the card neatly, placed it inside the box, and closed the lid. No expectation. No answer expected. just the act itself. Then, carefully, reverently, he opened the violin case. The scent of old wood greeted him, familiar now, comforting. He ran his fingers over the curves of the instrument. Lightly. Like reacquainting with something you once loved and had somehow forgotten. He didn't know how to play. Not really. A few lessons as a kid. Enough to know where the notes lived. But that didn't matter now. Agnes had said it wanted honesty, not perfection. So he held it, positioned it beneath his chin, drew the bow slowly across the strings. It squeaked, hesitated, then sang. Not beautifully, not even in tune, but with soul. He kept going, closed his eyes, let his fingers fumble and find their way. One note stretched into another. A fragile tune began to take shape. Something half remembered, half invented. Like the soundtrack to a dream you were still inside of. He didn't know how long he played. Time unraveled, melded. When he finally stopped, the apartment was filled with the kind of silence that follows something sacred. The kind that doesn't ask for applause. Just a heartbeat of stillness. Pepper stirred, stretched again, and blinked at him as if to say, "That'll do." He smiled, setting the violin down gently. And that's when he noticed the paper. There, beside the listening box, was a slip of notepaper he hadn't seen before. Folded once, tucked just beneath the latch. Callum's eyes widened. He picked it up. Opened it. No handwriting. No ink. Just one single pressed daisy. Fresh. Still fragrant. His breath caught. Somewhere in the world, a story had decided to answer without words. He didn't need to understand how. Or why. He only needed to understand what it meant. That the world was listening. That small things mattered. That sometimes, the softest days leave the deepest marks. Callum leaned back, gazed up at the ceiling, and whispered to no one in particular. "I'll remember this." And he would. Not just the violin. Or the food. Or the frog lamp. Or even the people. But the way it all came together. The way the ordinary had become something shimmering. The way a simple flea market had cracked open his chest and slipped a sliver of light inside. He stood, stretched, turned off the lamp, and left the window open just a little before heading to bed. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. Somewhere, a bell rang in the distance. Maybe a bicycle. Maybe something older. And the city slept. But inside one apartment on Elderberry Lane, a violin waited. And beside it, a daisy whispered what words could not. Act 10, Small Things, big echoes. A week had passed. But to Callum, it didn't feel like a week. It felt like before and after. Before the flea market, days blurred together, quiet and familiar, punctuated by books he never finished and playlists that looped like soft rain. After the flea market, everything seemed to hum just a little louder. The light looked warmer. Time moved more intentionally. He had started noticing things again. Like the way steam curled from his morning tea. The laugh of the girl in the bookstore 2 blocks down. The sound of violin strings in his dreams. It was a Thursday morning. He was standing at his kitchen counter, absent-mindedly buttering toast, when he caught himself humming a tune he didn't recognize. He stopped. Tried to trace the melody. And realized. It was the same tune he had played on the violin that night. Untrained. Wobbly. Honest. He dropped the knife, toast forgotten, and walked over to where the violin rested beneath the window. He picked it up. This time, no hesitation. He played. Still not expertly. Still not clean. But truer now. Like the violin had begun trusting him back. Pepper jumped on the windowsill, tail flicking, ears perked. Outside, someone walking by slowed down, turned their head slightly toward the open window, and smiled. Later that day, Callum found himself at a thrift bookstore he hadn't visited in months. The smell hit him immediately: old pages, ink, something vaguely floral. He wandered the aisles without intention. That's when he saw it. A framed black and white photograph. Propped between 2 dusty anthologies. It was a shot of a street market. Could have been anywhere. Could have been nowhere. But it looked exactly like the Maple Street flea market. And in the bottom corner of the photo, barely visible, was a violin case. He bought it without thinking. Brought it home. Hung it beside the Polaroid of himself from Cozy Bites. 2 different versions of the same truth. Jules dropped by that evening. She didn't knock. Just walked in with a bag of cherry turnovers and a box labeled Autumn Chaos. Decorations, she announced. You live like an off-season librarian. Time to spice it up. Callum laughed, setting his tea down. Let me guess. Ceramic pumpkins. Ceramic everything. They spent the next hour hanging fairy lights, arranging dried leaves in mason jars, and arguing over which candle smelled more like crisp memory, her words, not his. She paused once to look at the violin on the window seat. You've been playing? She asked. He nodded. She smiled. I'm glad. They didn't need to say more. Before she left, she handed him a folded piece of paper. I wrote my question, she said. For the listening box. Yup. Do you want to know if it gets answered? No. That's the magic. She hugged him before leaving, and for a moment, everything felt still again. Like the moment before something beautiful begins. That night, Callum lit a candle. Played another tune. Wrote down a second question. Not for the box. For himself. What would life feel like if I stopped waiting for meaning and just lived inside the small moments? He didn't answer it. He didn't need to. Because the answer wasn't a sentence. It was a series of things. The laughter over grilled cheese. The daisy in the box. The photograph in the bookstore. The feel of the violin against his shoulder. The wind rustling through flea market flags. And Jules. Always Jules. Later, as he sat on the fire escape with a blanket over his knees and Pepper curled on his lap, he looked out over the quiet town. He thought about how life was made of fragments. Tiny scenes stitched together with invisible thread. He smiled. Because now he knew something he didn't before. That the small things, the tiny, quiet, overlooked things, they echo. Louder than anything else. Chapter 2, Returning to the Place That Waits. Act 11, An Invitation from the Wind. It was a Friday afternoon, nearly a month since the flea market, when Callum found the envelope. It wasn't in his mailbox. It was wedged between the pages of a book he hadn't opened in years, Leaves of Grass, the copy his mother had given him when he left for university. He had pulled it from the shelf on a whim, hoping for a line that would make him feel less stuck in the moment. Instead, he found the envelope. Cream-colored. Unmarked. He opened it slowly, half expecting a blank note, or maybe a flyer for a missing cat. But instead, he found this. It's time again. Same place. Same kind of magic. Bring whatever has changed. M. There was no address. No signature. No date. But Callum knew. The Maple Street flea market was returning. He stared at the message for a long time, heart thudding with the quiet excitement only certain places can stir. Not the loud thrill of concerts or crowded parties, but the gentle kind. Like hearing a friend's voice after years, still familiar. Still safe. Callum picked up his phone. Callum, you got the note. Jules, what note? Callum, check your favorite book. 3 minutes of silence. Jules, okay, this is officially spooky. Also exciting. Callum, we going? Jules, are you kidding? The frog's already waiting by the door. That Sunday, they arrived just after dawn. The sky was silvered and soft, the trees still shaking off the mist. And yet, there it was, the market. like it had never left, like it had been waiting. Fewer people were there this early. Just the dedicated ones. The dreamers. The believers. Callum carried the violin case on his back now, comfortably. Not like a mystery anymore, but like something earned. Jules, as promised, had the ceramic frog nestled in a tote bag lined with bubble wrap and sass. The first thing they noticed, a new banner. Hand-painted, fluttering in the breeze. Autumn Market, Trade Memories, Find Yourself. Callum stopped. Trade Memories. Jules shrugged. I mean, we've definitely collected a few. As they stepped through the opening aisle, something hit Callum. This wasn't just another visit. This was a return. And returns always meant something was about to change. Act 12, The Return of Mr. Quince, and the Clock That Remembers. The maple leaves crunched beneath Callum's sneakers as he and Jules stepped into the older section of the flea market, past the colorful produce stalls, past the guitar-playing teenager crooning about coffee and heartbreak, past even Cozy Bites, which now sold warm apple cider in little jars labeled Brewed to Remember. And then there he was. Mr. Quince. Exactly where they had left him last time, though the seasons had turned. Still sitting in his wobbly folding chair, still sipping from his red thermos, still surrounded by a chaos of objects that looked like they'd survived both war and wedding receptions. His wooden sign now had a few new cracks, but the message was the same. Mr. Quince. Memory Merchant. Quince didn't look up as they approached. Instead, he rearranged a tray of worn books with covers long since faded. But as Jules set down the frog lamp on the corner of his table with a soft clunk, he spoke without looking. You again. She grinned. Tried to stay away. Frog wouldn't let me. Callum stepped beside her. Still selling memories. Quince leaned back slowly, as if measuring time through the creak of his spine. Some memories don't want to be sold, he said. They sit and sulk until someone comes along who remembers why they mattered. He looked up at them now. Sharp as ever. You two look changed. Callum glanced at Jules, who shrugged. We brought what changed. I see that, Quince said, his eyes settling on the violin case over Callum's shoulder. And what have you done with it? Callum hesitated. Played. Not well. But truthfully. Quince nodded, satisfied. Good. It's not the song that matters. It's whether you meant it. He reached beneath the table and pulled out a small, square object wrapped in black velvet. He set it on the table between them with both hands. Today, he said, I'm not selling. They blinked. Then what's this? Jules asked. Quince tapped the velvet. A test. A trade. A story that's waiting to finish itself. Slowly, Jules peeled back the cloth. Inside was a pocket watch. Old. Heavy. Gold-plated. Its face was cracked down the center, like a river splitting glass. The hour and minute hands both pointed straight down, stuck at 6:30. The chain was coiled beneath it like a sleeping serpent. Callum leaned closer. It's broken. Quince smirked. No. Just paused. Jules narrowed her eyes. And the trade? I give you this, Quince said. You find out what it remembers. Callum straightened. What it remembers. Quince folded his hands. You think only people carry memory. Objects are better at it. They don't filter. They don't deny. They just absorb. He leaned forward. This watch belonged to someone who vanished. Not died. Not ran. Vanished. Left the world like a bookmark falling from a page. And it's been waiting for someone to finish the sentence. Callum stared at the time, 6:30. It meant nothing to him. And yet, there was a pull. Like a thread wrapping around his ribs. I'll take it, he said. Quince didn't smile. But something behind his eyes softened. Then the trade is done. They walked away with the pocket watch nestled between Jules' scarf and the frog lamp in her tote. Neither spoke for a while. Finally, Jules said, "Do we even know what we just agreed to?" "No idea," Callum replied. "But I think we just adopted a mystery." She laughed, then grew quiet. "There's something weird about that watch." "How so?" "It feels heavy. Not just in weight. In story." They sat at their favorite bench, the one facing the oak tree near the bandstand, and Callum pulled the watch out again. The hands were still frozen at 6:30. He gently pressed the top latch. Click. The back opened. Inside was a small engraving. E. R. If you forget, I'll remember for both of us. Callum read it aloud. The words tingled against the afternoon breeze. Jules leaned in. E. R. Could be initials. Could be. I don't know. Callum turned it over, examining every scratch, every dent. It was old, yes, but cared for. The kind of object someone carried not out of habit, but devotion. Jules pulled out a small notebook from her bag. We need to start a list. A list. Clues. Impressions. Time, name, anything. We're solving this. Callum smirked. Didn't know we were mystery solvers now. We've already survived Mr. Quince and a frog with secrets, she replied. This is just the next level. She wrote. Pocket watch mystery. Time frozen at 6:30. Engraving, E. R. Message, if you forget, I'll remember for both of us. From Mr. Quince. Claimed it belonged to someone who vanished. Callum added, and it feels like it knows we're watching it. Jules paused. Creepy. But fair. They laughed. But it wasn't empty laughter. It was the sound of two people realizing they were no longer just browsing through a market. They were stepping into a story. That night, Callum sat by the window in his apartment again. The violin rested beside him. The photo of the market still hung on the wall. And in his hand, the pocket watch. He turned it over again. And again. No ticking. But not silent. It hummed with something older. Something waiting. He placed it beside the Polaroid, next to the daisy that had now dried into a golden memory. All right, he whispered. Let's see what you remember. Act 13, the first clue, echoes in the pages. The next morning, the city was still damp from a night of rain. Water clung to windows like translucent fingerprints. Elderberry Lane, usually lively by this hour, remained hushed under a cloudy gray sky. Callum stood in front of his bookshelf, eyes scanning titles like a detective at a crime scene. The pocket watch rested beside his teeth, ticking silently in spirit if not in function. 6:30. Still frozen. Still faithful. Jules had texted earlier. I think I know where to start. Meet me at Bowers Books at 10. Bring the watch. And your curiosity. He smiled at the last line. 10 minutes later, he was out the door, violin case slung over one shoulder, not because he planned to play, but because it had become a part of him. A reminder. A companion. Bowers Books was tucked between a laundromat and an old tailor shop. The bell above the door jingled as Callum stepped inside. The shop smelled of cinnamon, ink, and old stories. Jules was already there, kneeling on the floor with a stack of books beside her and a very grumpy orange cat curled on her backpack. I bribed him with a sardine cracker, she said, pointing to the cat. Didn't work. He's still judging me. Callum sat beside her. What are we looking for? She pushed a book toward him. Local history. I asked the shopkeeper about old town records. Turns out, there was an Elias Rowe. Watchmaker. Early 1900s. Lived here. Callum's heart skipped. Rowe. E. R. Jules nodded. And guess what? He vanished. In 1912. Callum blinked. Vanished. Literally. Went out for a walk and never came back. His apprentice said the last thing Elias told him was, "Time only runs for those who believe in it." Callum opened the book and found a passage himself. A grainy photograph showed a man with sharp features and a vest with chain watch links just barely visible. It was captioned, "Elias Rowe, master horologist and local eccentric. Last seen 6:30 p.m., May 14, 1912. Jules whispered, "The same time on the watch." Callum leaned back against the bookshelf. So this belonged to him. Or to someone who loved him, she said. Maybe the person who engraved it? Callum turned the watch over again, rereading the message. "If you forget, I'll remember for both of us." I wonder who wrote that. Jules looked thoughtful. "Maybe we're not supposed to know yet." They left the bookstore and walked through the misty streets. Everything looked different now, less ordinary. Like the world had hidden a secret in plain sight and only just begun to lift the curtain. They stopped by the town archive building, an old library-like structure with creaky floors and humming radiators. A woman at the front desk, bespectacled and wrapped in a shawl like a storybook librarian, handed them a dusty box labeled Rowe, Elias, Correspondence. Inside were letters. Dozens. One caught Callum's eye immediately. It was addressed to "My dearest E." But it wasn't signed. The handwriting was delicate, flourished, feminine. He read aloud. "I waited again by the sycamore. The one by the old station. You didn't come. But the wind carried your name anyway, as it always does. If you return, I will still be here. I always am." He looked at Jules. "Do you think she meant this sycamore? The one at the market?" Callum nodded. "It's the oldest tree in that lot." They stared at each other. Then Jules said, "Callum, what if we've been walking through their story all along?" That evening, Callum returned home and did something he hadn't done since he bought the watch. He held it, sat quietly. Then, he spoke to it. "I don't know if you're listening, or remembering, or both." He paused. "But I found you. "We found your tree." We read her words. The air didn't change. But the second hand twitched. He gasped. For the first time since he'd received it, the second hand moved. Not far. Not fast. Just one soft tick. Then stillness again. But that was enough. He called Jules immediately. It moved. What? The second hand. One tick. Just after I read the letter aloud. Jules was quiet for a second. Then. "Callum, I think this watch is a bridge." He blinked. A bridge. Between now and then. Between two people who never got to finish their story. Callum looked out the window, where the sycamore leaves whispered in the wind. And we're the ones walking it now. Act 14, Sycamore Whisper and the First Vision. The moon was high when Callum and Jules stood at the edge of the field where the old sycamore tree waited. Its gnarled branches stretched out like skeletal arms, holding the night sky as though it could pull it closer. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and the occasional gust of wind that seemed to push them forward, urging them to step closer. "I've walked by this tree hundreds of times," Jules said quietly, her breath misting in the cool air. "Never thought much of it." Callum glanced at her, his fingers lightly tracing the pocket watch in his pocket. "We've all walked by 100 things we never thought much of." The tree loomed ahead, its bark twisted and aged, and yet it felt as though something unseen pulsed within it. Callum could almost feel the pull, the weight of history, the hum of things left unsaid. They reached the base of the tree, its roots sprawling like veins across the earth. The ground was soft and mossy under their feet. "Do you think we'll find anything here?" Jules asked, looking up at the sycamore's crown, where the branches seemed to sway even without wind. "I don't know," Callum replied, his voice low. "But I think we'll find something more than we're expecting." Jules bent down to touch one of the roots, her fingers brushing against the rough surface of the tree's ancient skin. "It feels alive. But not in the way trees usually feel." Callum pulled the pocket watch from his pocket, the small weight of it grounding him in the moment. It was still ticking slowly, steadily. But now, the second hand was moving with a rhythm he could almost match to his heartbeat. "I think this is it," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "This tree, it's part of the story." They stood in silence for a moment, feeling the deep connection to the past press in on them from every side. And then, as if the tree was listening, the wind picked up, swirling around them with a strange intensity. Jules glanced at Callum, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. They both felt it, the shift in the air, like a door slowly creaking open. Suddenly, a voice seemed to drift through the leaves. "If you remember, I'll remember for both of us." Jules froze. "Did you hear that?" Callum nodded slowly. His pulse quickened. The wind swirled again, and a shape began to form within the tree's hollow, as though the wood itself were bending and shifting. "Who is that?" Jules breathed, stepping closer to Callum. The shape solidified, and before them, standing where the roots met the earth, was the faint outline of a man. His features were blurred, like a memory that hadn't fully formed. But his presence was undeniable. It was Elias Rowe. But not in the way they expected. He was not a ghost. Not a spirit. He was something in between. The air around him seemed to hum, and though he stood still, Callum felt his presence in his bones. Callum started, but the words caught in his throat. Elias Rowe smiled, though his expression was tinged with sadness. "You've come for the answers. But some answers aren't meant to be told. They must be remembered." Jules stepped forward. "What does that mean? Why were you waiting here?" The figure of Elias seemed to shimmer, flickering in and out of focus. "I waited for those who would listen. Those who would understand that time is not a line. It's a circle. And everything that's been lost can be found again. But only if you open your mind. Open your heart." Callum's grip tightened on the pocket watch, feeling the pulse of it against his hand. "How do we find it? What are we supposed to do with this?" Elias's form grew even more translucent, but his voice remained clear. "Time moves in patterns. Your story and mine, they're woven together. This watch was never just mine. It was yours. It belongs to you now." The air around them shifted, and the world seemed to blur for a moment, sounds and colors spiraling together until everything stood still again. When Callum opened his eyes, the figure of Elias Rowe was gone. The wind settled. The tree stood silent. Jules let out a breath. Was that real? Callum nodded slowly, staring at the spot where Elias had stood. He opened the pocket watch again. The hands were still at 6:30, but the second hand had started moving again. Slow, deliberate. A ticking that seemed to echo in the quiet. "It was real," Callum said quietly. "I don't know what it means yet, but it's real." Jules looked at him, her brow furrowed in thought. "And the watch? What do we do now?" Callum turned the watch over in his hand, looking at the engraving again. "If you forget, I'll remember for both of us." "I think," he said slowly, "we wait. And we listen." Act 15, Unraveling the Past, Piece by Piece. The days following their encounter with Elias Rowe felt suspended in time. Callum had never experienced anything quite like it, where the weight of an unanswered question could hang so heavily over every moment. Even the smallest things began to feel connected to the mystery they were now wrapped in. The way the wind rustled the sycamore leaves. The ticking of the pocket watch. The feeling that something was just waiting to be understood. But every time Callum sat with the watch in his hands, trying to unravel its secrets, he couldn't help but feel like they were only scratching the surface. What did Elias mean by time is a circle? That question gnawed at him, always there in the back of his mind. One evening, as Callum sat on his balcony, watching the moon rise, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Jules. "Meet me at the library tomorrow. I think I found something." The next morning, they sat together at a small table in the local library, surrounded by piles of dusty books and old maps. The scent of paper and history filled the air, grounding them in the very essence of what they were trying to uncover. Jules looked excited, her fingers flipping through a heavy ledger she had pulled from the restricted section. She'd gone to great lengths to track down old town records, and from the gleam in her eye, Callum could tell she was onto something big. "This," she said, tapping the page, "is a detailed journal from Elias Rowe's apprentice. It's not complete, but it's enough to give us a clue." Callum leaned over, eager to see what she had found. The journal was faded, its pages worn at the edges, but the handwriting was still legible. May 15, 1912. "The watch is finished. Elias promised it would be the last one. He said it would unlock a door we would never be able to close again. I don't know what that means, but I trust him. The last time I saw him, he looked different. Something changed." Callum's breath caught in his throat. He read the passage again. He said the watch would unlock a door. What does that even mean? Jules furrowed her brow. "It's the same day Elias vanished. May 15, 1912. This is the last entry." They sat in silence, processing the weight of the words. It seemed as if the watch wasn't just a timepiece, it was a key. A key to something deeper. Something that went beyond the mere ticking of hands. Jules flipped through the journal, turning the pages carefully, until she stopped at another entry. June 2nd, 1912. "I think Elias left something behind. I found a hidden compartment in the watchmaker's desk. Inside was a note, a map, and a photograph. I'm too scared to open it. I don't know what to do." Callum's pulse quickened. A map. A photograph. Yes. "But here's the thing," Jules said, looking up from the page. "The map doesn't lead to any place I've ever heard of. And the photograph, it's a photo of a tree, but not just any tree. It's the sycamore. The same one where we found Elias's message." Callum's mind raced. The tree. The watch. The message. It was all connected. They had to know more. They had to go back. They didn't waste time. The sky was already beginning to darken by the time they arrived at the old sycamore. This time, Callum carried the watch with him, not in his pocket, but in his hand. The cool metal against his fingers felt like it had a pulse of its own, as if it too was urging him forward. As they stood at the base of the tree, Jules took out the old photograph from the journal and held it up next to the sycamore. It was almost identical, the same gnarled branches, the same spread of leaves, but the photo had been taken in a different season. There was a small note written on the back of the photo. Underneath, where the roots meet the stone, you'll find the next piece. Callum's heart skipped a beat. Underneath the tree. Jules nodded. Let's dig. They spent the next hour carefully examining the base of the sycamore. The ground was soft, but as they dug near the stone foundation that the roots curled around, Callum's shovel struck something solid. Here, he said, excitement in his voice. Together, they cleared away the earth to reveal a small, weathered box, wooden and intricately carved. It was nearly buried, the markings worn by time. The box was locked, but the keyhole was familiar. It matched the one on the pocket watch. Callum held the watch up to the lock, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, as if the watch was waking up from a long sleep, the hands moved again. Slowly. Steadily. Until it clicked in place, and the box unlocked. They opened it together. Inside was a letter. The paper was old, fragile, and yellowed with age. The handwriting was elegant, but shaky, as if written in haste. To the one who finds this, the watch was never meant to be a burden. It was a promise. A promise that time, though fleeting, could be controlled. But only by those who truly understand its meaning. I knew I could not stay to fulfill the promise, but I believe you will. You were meant to find this. You were always meant to. The letter was signed with a single, familiar initial, E. R. Callum's hands trembled as he read the words aloud. Jules looked at him, her eyes wide. This is it. This is what Elias meant. He knew we'd come for this. I don't think he knew we'd come, Callum replied, but I think he knew someone would. And we're the ones. Act 16, The Promise Fulfilled. The evening was heavier than usual. The air, thick with the scent of earth and coming rain, hung around Callum and Jules like a blanket. They had not expected to find so much so quickly. Every piece of the puzzle they'd uncovered felt like a doorway opening, and each door led to another layer of mystery. They stood now at the base of the sycamore tree once more, the box containing Elias Rowe's final letter resting in Jules's bag. The watch, now ticking steadily in Callum's pocket, seemed to hum in sync with the rhythm of his heart. Do you think we're supposed to do something else? Jules asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, Callum answered, his eyes on the tree's twisting branches. The sky above them was clouded, the kind of gray that promised rain without delivering. I think it's time to figure it out. They had been coming here for hours, staring at the tree, trying to decipher every detail, every cryptic word left behind by Elias. The pocket watch had led them here, but it still didn't tell them what they were supposed to do next. Jules was the first to speak again. What if we've been reading this wrong? What if it's not about the past at all? Callum looked over at her, eyebrows furrowed. What do you mean? What if Elias's message wasn't for us to find the past? What if it's for us to create something new? She pulled the watch from his pocket, holding it up to the dimming light. Maybe the answer isn't in the old stories. Maybe it's about what we're going to do now. For a moment, Callum just stared at the watch, his fingers tracing its worn edges. The minute hand shifted slightly as though it had heard her words. He thought about everything they had uncovered, the mystery of Elias Rowe, the vanished apprentice, the map that led them here. But something about what Jules said struck him. He knew what they had to do. Let's go back to the market, he said suddenly. Jules blinked. Back to the market? You think there's something more there? I don't know. But I have a feeling Elias wasn't just talking about us finding the past. Maybe it's about what we're supposed to do with it. He looked at her, determination in his eyes. We've got one last step to take. And I think we'll find it there. They didn't waste any time. The rain had started, soft at first, but gaining strength with each minute. They didn't mind. They were used to the rain now. The Maple Street flea market was much quieter in the evening, the vendors packing up, the last of the merchandise being loaded into crates. But there, by the stage where the jazz band had once played, they found him again. Mr. Quince. Sitting as always, his folding chair barely visible beneath the clutter of items he had laid out. He wasn't looking at them when they approached, his hands working slowly to fold a well-worn map. Didn't expect to see you two back so soon, he said, his voice gravelly and calm. But I'm glad you're here. You've found it, haven't you? Callum glanced at Jules before answering. We found the letters. We found Elias Rowe's last message. Quince nodded slowly. I thought as much. We don't understand it all, Jules said, but we think we're supposed to do something. With the watch. With the tree. Mr. Quince's eyes twinkled. You've already begun, haven't you? The watch, that's the key. The promise it carries. But you can't just hold it in your hand. You have to let it do its work. Let time weave itself around you. Callum took a deep breath. But how do we finish it? Quince smiled and gestured toward the back of the market. You'll find the final piece at the end of the path. You just have to walk it. Without another word, he stood and began to pack up his things, as though his part in this was already finished. Callum and Jules exchanged glances, the weight of his words sinking in. The market had emptied out by the time they made their way toward the back. The familiar stalls were now abandoned, but the sense of something still lingering in the air was undeniable. At the far end of the market, behind the tents and canopies, stood a single, solitary bench. It wasn't anything special. Just an old wooden bench, weathered by years of neglect. But on it, glimmering in the dim light of the evening, was a small wooden box. Callum's heart raced as he approached. The box was simple, no carvings, no markings. Just a plain wooden box, like something someone might have tossed away. He knelt down and opened it. Inside, there was nothing but a small piece of paper, folded neatly. On it was one word. Complete. Jules picked up the paper and glanced at it. What does that mean? Callum didn't answer right away. He looked at the empty bench, the market fading behind them, and then back at the watch in his hand. It clicked. Complete, he whispered. We're supposed to finish this. Not for Elias. Not for the past. But for us. He took the watch and placed it in the box, the weight of it settling into the soft wood. Then, with a final deep breath, he closed the lid. For a moment, the world stood still. The rain, the market, the night, all of it faded. But then, there was a sound. A soft, echoing chime. The sound of a clock, ticking once more. Act 17, the completion, and the awakening. The rain had stopped by the time they left the market. The world felt washed clean, as if the storm had swept away not just the dust and the grime, but also the weight of the questions they had been carrying for so long. Callum and Jules walked side by side, the wooden box containing the pocket watch in Jules's bag. The night was quiet, save for the distant hum of streetlights and the occasional rush of a car passing by. But to Callum, the silence felt more like a bridge connecting him to a deeper understanding of everything he had learned. It's done, isn't it? Jules asked, her voice soft but steady. Callum nodded slowly, though he wasn't entirely sure. The box, now resting at the bottom of her bag, felt like a link between worlds, one that connected the past with the present, the living with the forgotten. But there was still a part of him that wondered if this was truly the end. Or if, like time itself, it was just another cycle, waiting to begin again. I think so, he said, his voice thoughtful. I think the watch is more than just a story. It's a symbol. A reminder. A reminder of what? Jules asked. That time doesn't just move forward. It's always circling back on itself. And sometimes, things don't end when we think they do. Jules stopped walking for a moment, turning to face him. Her eyes searched his, as though trying to read the thoughts he hadn't yet voiced. You're not afraid of what comes next, Are you? She asked quietly. Callum looked down at the watch in her back, then back up at her. I'm not afraid. I'm curious. Jules smiled softly, as if she had been waiting for him to say that. Then let's keep moving forward, together. Whatever it is. They continued walking, and Callum felt something inside him shift. It wasn't just the completion of the mystery. It wasn't just the discovery of Elias Rowe's secrets. It was something deeper, something about the journey they had taken, the friendship they had formed, and the way the world had opened up to them. Later that night, back at his apartment, Callum sat by the window, staring out at the city. He still held the pocket watch, now resting on the table before him. The soft ticking was constant, like the pulse of the world. But there was something more to it now. He had spent hours thinking about everything that had happened. The events at the flea market, the conversations with Mr. Quince, the encounter with Elias Rowe's spirit. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle that had finally clicked into place. But what was the final picture? Callum's fingers brushed over the smooth surface of the watch, and in that moment, he realized something. It wasn't just about finding answers. It was about understanding that there are no final answers. That the story is never truly finished. It just keeps unfolding, over and over again, in different ways. A soft knock at the door broke his thoughts. Callum. Jules's voice came through the door. Can I come in? Of course, he replied, and the door creaked open. Jules stepped inside, her eyes bright. I've been thinking. Maybe we don't need all the answers right now. Maybe it's enough to just know that we've made it this far. Callum smiled, leaning back in his chair. I agree. But I think we're not done yet. Jules raised an eyebrow. You mean there's more? He nodded, his gaze returning to the watch. I think the story is still writing itself. And we're part of it. The question is, what do we do with it now? Jules walked over and sat next to him. We live it. We take what we've learned and use it to move forward. The words felt right. They felt like they belonged. For the first time in a long time, Callum didn't feel lost. He didn't feel like he was waiting for something to happen. He felt like he was part of something bigger, something more than he had ever imagined. The watch had given him that. Not just the answers, but the permission to live, to move, to grow. To step into the future without fearing what came next. You're right, Callum said quietly, looking at her. Let's see where this road takes us. A week later, Callum found himself back at the same park where he had first taken the violin. The sun was setting, casting long shadows on the grass. The air smelled like spring fresh, with a hint of earth and rain. He hadn't planned to come here today, but something had drawn him back. He sat down under a tree, the violin resting on his lap. The pocket watch was in his pocket, ticking steadily, a reminder of everything that had happened. He took the violin in his hands, fingers instinctively finding the strings. And as he began to play, the world around him seemed to fall away. The music wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished. But it felt honest. It felt real. The sounds echoed through the park, soft but full of life. There was no audience, no applause. Just the music, the evening air, and the quiet hum of time moving on. When he finished, he set the violin down beside him and leaned back against the tree. The pocket watch ticked in his pocket, as though it had never stopped. For the first time, Callum didn't need to search for anything. He had already found what he was looking for. Act 18, Stepping into the Unknown. The days after the market felt like an odd, quiet dream. The streets were the same. The coffee shops. The parks. Even the air, thick with the scent of early autumn, was the same. But Callum couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed. It wasn't anything tangible. It wasn't something he could touch, see, or even hear. But inside him, there was a shift. A soft, constant hum that followed him wherever he went. It was like the watch, still ticking in his pocket, had somehow woven itself into the fabric of his life. Jules, on the other hand, was restless. "I think we've done all we can here," she said one morning, watching the early sunlight filter through the blinds. "Don't get me wrong, I love our town. But something's pulling at me. Like there's more to find." Callum glanced over at her, then looked down at the violin, now resting in its case beside him. "You want to go somewhere? Do something new?" Jules nodded. "I don't know where. But maybe, we need to keep moving. Not just through this town, but through life." Callum smiled softly, though he wasn't entirely sure what she meant. But he understood that feeling. It was the same restlessness he had felt before the flea market. Before the watch. Before the whole story had started. The road ahead wasn't clear. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that maybe that was the point. "Okay," he said finally, standing up. "Let's go." 2 days later, they were on the road. They hadn't planned it. There was no final destination in mind. Just a general sense of wanting to keep moving forward. The car hummed steadily beneath them as they drove through the countryside, the fields stretching out on either side. It was the kind of drive where you let the windows down, let the wind rush through your hair, and let the world pass by without feeling the need to make sense of it all. For the first time, Callum felt a sense of freedom that he hadn't known he needed. It wasn't the same kind of freedom he had imagined, free from responsibility, free from commitment. It was different. It was a freedom from expectations. A freedom to simply exist, without the pressure of having to figure everything out. After a few hours, Jules pulled into a small, quiet town. It was nothing like where they'd come from. The streets were narrow, the buildings aged with time, and the air smelled like salt and earth. They didn't even need to say anything to each other, both of them knew this was the place. "This is it," Jules said with a small smile, pulling into a parking space beside a little coffee shop. "What do you think?" Callum got out of the car and looked around. It felt peaceful. Calm. Like they had found a pocket of the world that wasn't rushed. He nodded. "Yeah. This is it." They spent the day walking through the town, exploring quiet corners, talking to shopkeepers, and slowly becoming part of the town's rhythm. There was no rush. No agenda. Just the present. And, somehow, that felt like everything. Later that evening, they sat on a bench by the beach, watching the sun set behind the waves. The world seemed so much smaller here, so much easier to breathe in. Callum's fingers brushed against the pocket watch in his jacket, the ticking sound soft in his pocket. He glanced over at Jules. "Do you think we're supposed to go back?" Jules looked out at the water, then turned to face him. "Go back where?" "Home. To our lives," he said quietly. She shook her head, her gaze steady. "We're already home, Callum. I think this is it. This is the start of something new. It's not about going back anymore." For the first time, he realized she was right. He didn't need to go back. He didn't need answers. The road ahead was wide open, and it was his to walk. The next morning, they woke up early and walked to the small bookstore they had passed the day before. The sign outside read, "New Beginnings Bookstore." It felt like a sign, but not in a cheesy way. More like a quiet, personal invitation. Inside, the store was warm and inviting, shelves packed with books of every size and color. A small bell jingled as they stepped inside. The old man behind the counter looked up from his book. He had glasses perched on the edge of his nose and a smile that seemed like it had never quite left his face. "Good morning," he said kindly. "Looking for something specific?" Jules nodded. "Actually, we're just browsing. We just got here, and I think we're looking for something to help us figure out what's next." The man chuckled softly, as though he understood. "That's the story of all of us, isn't it?" Callum smiled, glancing around. "Do you have anything on the idea of time?" The man's eyes twinkled. "You're in luck. Follow me." He led them to the back corner of the store, where a small section of books was dedicated to time philosophy, history, even a few on time travel. One book stood out immediately. Its cover was simple, an old leather-bound journal with no title, just a symbol of an hourglass. The man handed it to them. "This one's a personal favorite. It's about the nature of time and how it shapes our lives. Maybe it'll help you with what you're searching for." Jules flipped through the pages, skimming the text. "I think this is exactly what we need." Callum smiled. Maybe they weren't so lost after all. That night, as they sat under the stars, with the ocean waves crashing softly in the distance, Callum held the book in his hands. The pages were worn and faded, like something that had been read 1,000 times before. But it felt like the right book. The right message. And for the first time, he didn't feel like they were searching for something. They were already living it. They didn't need to find the answers. They already had everything they needed. Act 19, New Paths, New Connections. The morning was crisp with the promise of something new. The soft rays of the sun filtered through the thin curtains of their small rented cottage by the beach, casting patterns on the wooden floors. Callum stretched lazily and pulled himself from the warmth of the bed, taking in the fresh smell of salt air drifting through the open window. It had been 2 weeks since they had arrived in this quiet town, and though it was small, it had a way of making you feel like you had everything you needed right in front of you. Jules was already awake, sitting cross-legged on the small couch with a cup of coffee in her hand. The familiar scent of the drink mixed with the salty air, creating a strange but comforting contrast. "You up?" she asked, looking over at him with a quiet smile. "The world is still out there waiting for us." Callum returned her smile, still a bit sleepy. "Yeah, but maybe it doesn't need to chase us anymore." Jules raised an eyebrow at him. "What does that mean?" "I mean, maybe we don't need to be in a rush anymore. Maybe we're supposed to just be here. Live." The idea had been slowly forming in Callum's mind over the past few days, but it felt solid now. After everything they had experienced through the flea market, the watch, Elias Rose mystery, it was clear to him that the journey hadn't just been about uncovering secrets of the past. It was about learning to live fully in the present, not waiting for something to change, but accepting the beauty of what was already here. Jules sipped her coffee, thoughtful. "You think we've figured it out?" "I think we're still figuring it out," Callum replied, walking over to the window and looking out at the quiet town. "But we've made it this far. And maybe that's enough for now." They spent the rest of the day exploring the town, moving slowly through its streets like they were taking the time to truly see everything around them. Callum noticed things he had missed before: the little bookstore with its wooden sign swinging lazily in the wind, the art gallery tucked down an alley, the old cafe that smelled like freshly baked bread. The town felt like a secret, a place for those who didn't need to be anywhere else. That afternoon, they came across a small park with a fountain in the center. The water flowed gently, the sound calming and soothing. They sat on the bench, and Jules pulled out a small notebook she had started filling with thoughts, observations, and even sketches of things she found inspiring. "You've been writing a lot," Callum remarked, watching her scribble something down. She looked up and smiled. "I guess I never realized how much I wanted to record. It feels like I'm finding things I didn't know I was searching for." Callum nodded. "It's like that for me too. I thought I was supposed to find answers, but now I realize that living the question is enough." Jules's smile widened. "That's exactly it. We've been chasing something, but we didn't even know what it was. Now, it's about finding joy in the moments we have right in front of us." They sat in companionable silence for a while, just listening to the sounds of the park. The rustling of leaves in the breeze, the occasional chirp of a bird, the soft gurgle of the fountain. It was simple, but it was enough. That evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Callum found himself standing outside their cottage, holding the pocket watch in his hands. He had kept it close ever since their journey began, but now, for the first time, he wasn't worried about what it could reveal. He simply turned it over, feeling the cool metal against his palm. The second hand still ticked, slowly but steadily. "You know," he said aloud, "I think it's time to stop worrying about what happens next." Jules stepped beside him, watching the sunset as well. "Yeah," she said, her voice soft. Maybe the secret was always about enjoying the moments along the way. Callum looked at her, a quiet understanding passing between them. Maybe it was never about what we find. Maybe it's about how we choose to live once we've found it. Days turned into weeks, and though the questions had quieted, the sense of adventure hadn't faded. It had simply shifted into something else, a quieter, more present feeling that hung around them like the scent of the ocean. They continued to explore, to create. Sometimes they would sit in cafes, reading books, laughing at nothing. Other days, they wandered to new towns, discovered hidden trails, or made small connections with the locals they met. Every moment felt like it was part of something bigger. One afternoon, while they were browsing an antique store on the edge of town, Callum found something that made him pause. It was a small, delicate clock, one that seemed similar to the pocket watch. Its hands were frozen at 6:30. He picked it up carefully, his fingers tracing the engraved design on the back. There was no name, no inscription, but it felt familiar, like it was somehow tied to everything they had experienced. Jules came over, her curiosity piqued. "What's that?" "It's like the watch," Callum said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Another piece of the puzzle. Maybe it's just a clock, but it feels like it's waiting for something." Jules grinned. "You found your new obsession, huh?" Callum nodded, holding the clock in his hands as he looked at the ticking second hand. "Maybe it's not about finding the end of the journey. Maybe it's about discovering new paths we didn't even know we were meant to take. Jules placed her hand on his shoulder. Whatever path we're on, I'm glad we're on it together. Act 20, The Endless Journey. The days had blurred together. Callum sat by the window again, his gaze lingering on the horizon. The world outside seemed so simple, so still, yet it felt like everything had changed. The clock, the one he had found weeks ago, now rested on the shelf beside him, its second hand ticking rhythmically, just like the pocket watch had. Both were reminders. Both were symbols of something deeper that had unfolded within him. Jules entered the room, her footsteps light on the wooden floor. She was holding a small journal in her hands, a new one this time. The pages were blank, waiting to be filled. Another one? Callum asked, his voice warm with affection. She smiled. I think it's time to write down what we've learned. What we've experienced. The things we never could have imagined when we first started. Callum chuckled softly, leaning back in his chair. I always thought the answers would come to us. That we'd find some grand revelation. Jules sat next to him, opening the journal and flipping through its empty pages. And now? Now, I think the answers are in the living itself. In what we choose to do, how we choose to be. She nodded, her eyes thoughtful. Maybe the journey doesn't have a final destination. Maybe it's just a series of steps, moments, connections. A thread that keeps weaving itself. Callum reached over and took the journal from her hands. He opened it to the first page and wrote the simplest thing that had been on his mind since the beginning. We are here. That is enough. He smiled at the words, letting them sink in. The weight of the watch, the search for answers, all of it had led him to this moment. And it felt like the most profound truth of all. Weeks passed. They didn't go back to the market. They didn't go searching for anything more. Instead, they stayed rooted in the life they were building, the life they had chosen. Callum began performing more frequently, his violin now an extension of himself. It wasn't about fame or recognition anymore. It was about the music itself, about expressing the parts of himself that had once been buried under questions and doubts. Jules, on the other hand, found herself teaching at the local library, helping others find stories in books, just as she had once done for herself. They both found contentment in these small but meaningful acts. One quiet afternoon, while sitting in the cafe they frequented, a letter arrived for them. It was an invitation to return to the Maple Street Flea Market, the same market that had begun their journey, the market that held all the mysteries they had unraveled. Jules opened the letter and read aloud. We are waiting for you. Return to where it all began. The story has yet to end. Callum looked at her, the weight of the words settling in. They didn't need to say much. Both of them understood what this invitation meant. I think we should go, Callum said. Jules nodded. But not to finish something. To start something new. The next morning, they found themselves back at the familiar place, the Maple Street Flea Market. The air was crisp, and the first signs of autumn had begun to paint the trees in shades of gold and red. The market looked the same, but there was something different now. It wasn't just a collection of stalls or curiosities. It felt like the starting point of another journey. As they walked through the aisles, Callum noticed something familiar, a small wooden booth in the corner, the one that had always seemed to hum with its own quiet magic. It was Mr. Quince's stall. But this time, when they approached, he wasn't behind the counter. Instead, he stood by the table, hands folded in front of him, a knowing smile on his face. "You came back," he said, his voice like a distant melody. "I wondered when you would." Callum and Jules exchanged a look. "It felt like the right time," Jules replied. Mr. Quince nodded. "Time has a way of working itself out, doesn't it?" Callum smiled. "It does. But I think we're done searching." "Maybe," Mr. Quince said, his eyes twinkling. "But there's always more to see. More to discover." Jules stepped forward, holding out the small journal. "We're not looking for answers anymore. We're just living it." Mr. Quince took the journal and flipped through the pages, his fingers tracing the words Callum had written. He stopped at the last page, where they had written their own truth. "We are here. That is enough." He smiled, closing the journal. "Exactly. That's the secret, you know. It's not about finding something. It's about realizing that you already have everything you need." And with that, he turned, fading into the backdrop of the market, as if he had always been a part of it, a part of the story. As Callum and Jules walked away from the booth, they found themselves standing at the entrance of the market once more. The world was the same as it always had been, but something inside them had shifted. They had arrived at the end of one chapter, yes, but there was so much more ahead. Callum looked at Jules, his heart full of gratitude. "Do you think it's over?" She smiled softly. "I don't think it's ever over. I think it's just the beginning." And for the first time, Callum realized she was right. The journey wasn't a destination. It was a lifetime of moments, discoveries, and connections, moments like these, where time itself didn't matter. It was simply about being here. Being alive.